I'm going to read you a piece that is a weaving of my book. So it's different parts pulled together, hopefully in a cohesive narrative. And I just want to give background for those of you who aren't so familiar with the book or are thinking of getting it, haven't gotten it yet. My mother died by suicide in 1963. I was 4 years old, and it was after a protracted custody battle with my father. It was a 2-year custody battle for her trying to get the return of her children. And as a child psychiatrist, I set out to understand who my mother was and why she took her own life. And so now I'm going to read. The day my mother killed herself, she had just finished preparing her house on Marlborough Street for the anticipated return of her children after a fierce custody battle with my father. It was a house expecting people, 14 rooms and 5.5 baths in a turn of the century of the townhouse on a tree-lined street near the Boston Public Garden, where my mother lived with her new husband, Alex. I imagine that when my mother heard Judge Whittemore's decision, cold dread must have overcome her. In my mind, she was white as powder, her body slack and weighted down, stumbling from one room to the next, overwhelmed by the vacancy. It is family lore that I am the last person my mother saw before she killed herself. She drove to my father's house, pleading to see the children, but I was the only child at home. My father demanded that she leave, be our housekeeper, hustled me out of the door and down the driveway toward my mother, who waited desolate on the street. She bent down and caressed my hair, I remember, as she whispered instructions to Bea to watch over us, especially me. And then she left. She left a suicide note as well as a grocery list, a list in preparation for our arrival that would never happen. 6 tangerines, 2 boxes of Kleenex, pink is crossed out and replaced by blue, sugar-free root beer, blue toilet paper, 4 pounds rump roast, lettuce, tomatoes, food for a family. I am often asked if I remember my mother. I appreciate that the question is a way to express the hope that my loss has been tempered, at least, by a photograph, a necklace, or her words. Anything I might call on to evoke her presence. But I have few mementos, and even fewer memories. My mother is defined by her absence. Yes, some treasures can kindle her presence, a dainty birth announcement on elegant paper, stamped with the date of my birth, a tarnished silver baby cup, dented at the rim and inscribed with my name, my worn woolen baby blanket, a pamphlet from my mother's campaign for the Boston School Committee. I have a few photographs, the pictures, a tatty blanket, a baby's cup. These objects are all that I have after my mother's death. When I was young, I thought a fire had destroyed all her belongings. My father eventually told me when I was about 14 that my mother had attempted suicide 2 years before her death. My sister and I discovered the facts ourselves in our trusted library microfilm collection. We found a picture of my mother in the Record American, looking much younger than she does in her formal portrait. She wears a sporty silk scarf tied casually around her neck. She is spunky with her upturned nose. Takes 3 handfuls of sleeping tablets, the caption reads. Why did my mother kill herself? My memories don't provide an answer, and I'm wary of my father's account because it's not my own. And my mother's affair that led her away from the marriage must have jolted him. But as a psychiatrist, I'm prepared, I hope, to understand. In The Anatomy of Suicide, the clinical researcher Leston Havens writes that suicide is the final common pathway of diverse circumstances of an interdependent network rather than an isolated cause, a knot of circumstances tightening around a single time and place. Suicide demands to be explained by the living as a way to absolve or condemn the survivors. I have tried to create a meaningful narrative to understand what happened, recognizing that the truth is buried with the victim and that questions will always linger. When I met people as I was growing up, all the way to medical school interviews, if I told them that my mother died when I was 4, they were curious about how she died. The question was irresistible. Most people seemed relieved when I said barbiturates, as if death and sleep are siblings. People wanted to know why and what was the cause. Such questions are usually edged with a fear that premature death, especially a self-inflicted death, might somehow be contagious. Why would she kill herself becomes, what does this mean about you? Somehow, confessing that my mother committed suicide felt incriminating, proof that my mother's life was out of control. I worried that they would mistakenly assume I somehow played a part in that. A secure mother-child bond is created when a mother provides her baby with the comforting rhythms of feeding, sleep, and an organized home. Without that gentle sense of order, children may have difficulty managing their emotions, lack self-control, and lose confidence in their likability. Either I have a very active imagination, or my mother must have been able to keep her sadness at bay long enough to nurture me as a baby. During the 1950s, my mother was unusual, an upper-class woman who had 6 children and worked outside of the home. The prevailing cultural expectation was for women to tend to the home, not orchestrate campaigns. My mother had enough resources to hire support to care for her brood so that she could conduct a career also. Because she had grown up as the daughter and granddaughter of Massachusetts politicians, she was enamored with politics. Many pundits of that time, however, were disparaging about women in public life. In 1956, Life magazine published interviews with 5 prominent male psychiatrists who blamed the rising divorce rate on the fatal error that feminism propagated. They warned that women were neglecting their maternal instincts, competing with their husbands, and causing psychological damage to their children. Those were the times my mother lived in and forged a career as she raised a family. And here I am, a wife, a mother, with a very full career. I am aware of the impact of my past, and I do not want distance with my children, the shadow of unexplored grief. Rather than burdening my children with my bereavement, I want to let them see how I deal with the painful longing for lost family without depriving them of my presence. I don't want to be overly nostalgic about my mother. I don't want the upheaval of my loss to undermine how I connect with my children. Rather, I want to find strength in understanding. My children have watched me as I've tried to understand who my mother was, knowing that I write letters to Mama that are my way of telling my mother who I am and who my children are becoming. I try to penetrate the incomprehensible mystery of her death and to somehow show them our enduring connection to those we love. Corey, some of you know he's my middle son, ever the concrete thinker, once asked me, where was I sending the letters? Lila, my oldest, said that maybe in my dreams my mother would write back. Sometimes I peer into an apparent void, a one-way dialogue with too much room for projection. My family history gives me a fragmented and sanitized view of my mother. I often feel as if I am figuratively tugging on her apron strings, pleading for something more, starved for a tasty morsel that will satiate my desire to know her in a way that is intimate and familiar. For years, I had nothing of my mother's, nothing concrete. Suddenly, a trunk of her belongings came to light. A blue trunk with brass hinges, with drawing letters, all kinds of material that my mother had saved. Seeing these objects stunned me. I stood there staring. I was nervous and intrigued about what I would discover. Here was evidence of a life I did not know. Small calendars with hand-scrawled appointments, a high school yearbook, report cards, school awards, newspaper clippings, and chatty letters from her friends. A photo of my mother cradling me as a baby in her arms. A photo of my mother and father, their eyes filled with laughter. Her handwriting, big and full. And the novel she was in the process of writing at the time of her death. I was disturbed that it had taken so long for Dad to give his children the contents of the trunk. Dad later told me he had enough integrity not to destroy it. I kept it for a couple of years and didn't know what the hell to do with it. I didn't want to be involved in dividing things. God forbid something was missing. I never opened the trunk and I didn't know what was in it. Her novel for me was an amazing discovery. This was an irresistible chance to know my mother's mind. Writers cannot escape that the person in charge of organizing a story reveals who she is just by the nature of how she fabricates the narrator's voice. My mother wrote in her notes about her novel, "Is this sheer purgative autobiography, or do I want others to see it?" I can understand her trepidation. It's hard to be exposed and to feel judged. As a psychiatrist, I live in the land of thoughts, and at the risk of overinterpreting, I hoped that this unexpected, interesting slip, don't read into that, unexpected access to my mother's mind would reveal how she constructed a narrative of meaning, her personal truth. Perhaps it would illuminate how my mother came to see suicide as an option, or how she came to accept the apparent futility of life. As a daughter who has longed for a connection to my mother, I want to know her inner thoughts, to discover her secret messages to me. I want a good story so I can be proud of her. I want to read as a detective and discern what is autobiographical and what is fiction. I know I must have known her long enough to love her, or I wouldn't be working so hard to try to understand who she is. My mother's journals were another rich source of insight into her joys and her anguish. It is clear that she was given to bouts of depression. She wrote vividly about the depth of it and the hopelessness that her affair plunged her into. And this is my mother's voice. I want to make sure you know this when I read this next part. Make sure you can hear it too. Long and uncertain stretched the smooth, black road, urging one into forgetfulness, deceiving one into daydreams. Long, long, black insomniac nights, broken only by the white line of consciousness and hateful solitudes, as indistinguishable from one another as curves and crossroads before the headlights. Consciousness, uniqueness slowly drains away from the asphalt and from the cottony, lonely wakefulness until finally there is nothing but the black road ahead and death. Death is a change in degree rather than in kind, and for many of us is a blessing in neon rather than in disguise. My mother goes on, "My Holy Ghost or my babies, this is my last testament. Perhaps they'll never be strong enough to read my naked soul. Most children prefer a mother to a human being. So do most mothers. My great cross is the inability to lose me in my mother, whether the mother is me or the woman who carried me. Those of us who fight must die. We are all consumed one way or another. I just choose to die from life rather than from the slow creeping death of boredom and rote and repetition and habit and conformity and vile hatred passed off as love. The flame of desire for truth, for reality, can burn up all the peace we're rationed. Oh God, where are you? I can tell you what I wanted before, but what do I want now? I guess I'd settle for peace, but that's second best." These are hard words to read as a daughter. Her pain is palpable. She seems to be making a choice. For this passionate and charismatic woman, there clearly was no answer, and she could find no viable choice for herself. Orwell, in his essay, Why I Write, says that authors are driven on by some demon whom one can neither resist nor understand. My journey was one of unrelenting sadness, curiosity, and passion in a quest to understand how, if my mother loved her 6 children, and clearly she did, how she could have abandoned us in this brutal way. As I charted her journey, I revolved around a fixed point, my mother's suicide, and followed any lead that helped me to understand who she was. It was as if the North Star of my existence was framed by trying to resolve this mystery. Sometimes, on my odyssey of discovery, I had interviews that made the story more complicated and challenging. For those of you who've read it, talking to my mother's ex-lover after 40 years revealed both disturbing and insightful information. The doctor who took care of my mother after her final overdose, when she was in a coma, taught me more. My 5 brothers and sisters offered their poignantly different perspectives. Through the scrutiny of her unpublished novel with the ominous title, End of Freedom, I learned more about the tremendous challenges she faced and to accept her more fully, realizing that what she did had nothing to do with us, her children. Through all this searching and introspection, I have gained new understanding, not just of her life, but of mine, and been able to examine some of my greatest fears. The process hopefully has led me to be more open and present for my patients and able to go deeper with them in their own traumas. It's freed me, on a good day, to be a better mother to my own 3 children. I offer my own story as a tribute to the endurance of the human spirit. When loss happens, we can find a way forward. No one is expendable, and we are all loved. By looking at her traumatic childhood, I understand the confusion she must have lived with and her deep dilemma. By sharing her journey as best I can reconstruct it, perhaps I can lend a little light to this widespread tragedy where 33,000 people a year kill themselves. To help break the terrible silence and dispel the shame that so often surrounds suicide. And to encourage people to get the support they need. If my book touches anyone that way, my mother's journey was not in vain. I often say it is a gift from the grave that my mother gave me. Suicide is a forbidden topic, and the investigative energy to understand the intensity of it served as a constant reminder of how precious it is for me to be a mother to my children. As Blake said, joy and woe are woven fine, and there is a certain freedom that comes from looking at the dark side and weaving a tapestry of meaning that anchors us in survival and the living soul. Every time I am introduced as an author, or sign a book, or get an amazing response from a reader who's moved to think deeply and ask large questions that defy easy answers, it is delicious, and I savor the journey. Writing may be about demons and self-doubt, but at this point, I would highlight the rewards. It took me 18 years of painful delving into the past to write. Did I find all the answers? No. As I said, they are buried. Did I reclaim a lost mother? Yes, to a certain degree I did. I feel she is present to me now, not just fleeting impressions and yearning. I have grown to love my mother in a way that is different from when I longed for her as a little girl. There is a joy in that, until at last becoming a writer. I am profoundly aware that when I die, a part of me will remain in my children in the same way that our bones carry the same minerals that compose a star.